So I started my presentation with a question that Carl answered, but I'm going to proceed as normal. Can history be understood scientifically? Now, by this, do I mean is history dictated by real inner laws that can be understood objectively? And this is a very important question, because our task as communists is to end the class oppression that exists today. But in order to understand how we can change the world and keep it changed, we inevitably run into questions that push us towards the past. Where did oppression come from? Why did previous revolutions either succeed or fail? And what does this all mean, right? You know, as Joel said earlier, before we act, we have to understand. So we study history in depth. If you come up to any of our bookstalls, you'll find thousands and thousands of pages on historical writing. But it's not just an academic exercise. It's not just because it's interesting, although it is very interesting, but it's a process of arming ourselves with the lessons provided by the past so that we can fight and win today. And I'd say we treat history like any other science. We don't just go in with the goal of making these big collections of raw data. It's not just about memorizing times and names like probably the way you're taught history in high school, right? A very dry and boring way. But we investigate in order to generalize out laws that help orient our understanding of current society. And I think it's understanding the laws of history that will allow us to improve society. It's the exact same way that biologists have developed medicine through their understanding of their own science, and the way that we've been able to develop forms of flight by understanding physics. A scientific understanding of history will equip us with the tools that we need to change history. And I'd say this view of history, this scientific view of history, is something that distinguishes communists. We're really the only ones who present history in this sort of way. You find that under capitalism, all areas of study tend to be less and less scientific the closer that you get to humanity. The social sciences are usually just filled with the crude prejudices of the bourgeois class. I'd say bourgeois ideology is completely riddled with idealism and is typically bounded by these different theories that don't elevate our understanding of history, but mystify it and make anything impossible to understand. I'd say this applies to more or less every major trend in bourgeois history, but I think there are two very popular ones that are worth looking at. The first is great man theory, this idea that history is really just dictated by the wills of these different great individuals. I'd say this is how most popular history is written. You'll read a book by, George Washington that has hundreds and hundreds of pages about his diet and his exercise routine and all this sort of thing. And it's the way that we're presented how, history came into being, right? Or capitalism came into being. Why do we live under capitalism today? Because some people just decided that capitalism would be a good thing to try out, and the rest of society just decided to, adopt it. Now, first of all, this view reduces the vast majority of humanity to a completely passive role, which I think really reflects the way that, to be honest, the ruling class views the masses. It's really this impression of the prejudices of the bourgeoisie. But also, when you break it down, it doesn't describe anything at all, does it? Why did capitalism come into being the way that it did? Why didn't it emerge 1,000 years later or 1,000 years earlier? Who knows? With this view of history, all of history is completely arbitrary. I'd say the other major trend in history we see today is the postmodernist view of history. Postmodernism is essentially this idea that there is no objective reality. And the postmodernists say that history doesn't follow any kind of lawfulness at all, that it's essentially just random. And you see this in a ton of different history books today. There's a couple popular books, like The Dawn of Everything, co-written by the anarchist David Graeber. You also have Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari, which is a very big book. These books kind of present this idea that history is shaped by stories or games or really just the imagination, that humans just decide to live in the way that they do, and there's no point to try to understand that behavior. You can really just say that is how humans behave, right? You also have the works of postmodernists like Michel Foucault. I'd say Foucault was really the postmodernist who made the most serious attempt to apply postmodernism to history. And he has this focus on, you could call them microhistories, because it's based on this idea that you can't understand really anything outside of subjective experiences. So it's just about recounting the subjective lived experiences of more and more and more specific groups. Now, these ideas of postmodernism are very popular on the left, and they're often cloaked up in this sort of radical language. But really, the postmodernist view of history, in essence, comes to the same conclusion as the great man view of history. The world is the way it is just because. The world is the way it is today because of something innate in humans that you can't understand or hope to change. What the postmodernists say about history is not any different than just saying, oh, inequality is just human nature, right? It's the exact same thing. And this immediately leads us into pessimism. And I'd say anybody who writes about history from a subjectivist point of view, tends to have a really dreary outlook on humanity, to be honest. Foucault is a very good example. He says that all oppression comes from this abstract force that he calls power. And power isn't really anything with an origin or an end to it, and it exists in new ways all the time. So really the best thing we can hope for is this eternal struggle against power. That's a very depressing view. And as I said at the beginning, both views prevent us from understanding the world the way that it truly is. And because of this, they are inherently reactionary ideas. But I would say there's no reason to believe that history actually works like this. For example, it contradicts much of what we do know about history. If history is only shaped by the ideas of people or by their own will, then why are there so many instances in history where people get the exact opposite of what they fought for, what they said they stood for? Maybe the American Revolution is a very good example of this. When you look at the people who fought in the American Revolution, what did they believe they were fighting for? They wanted democracy. They thought they were making this kind of new land of liberty, right? But the consequences was that they ended up creating the most reactionary force on the planet. So I think even this example suggests that there's something deeper here. There's a deeper force at play than just ideas or human agency. And I'd say idealist views of history contradict everything that we know about reality and just the natural world around us. Everything is controlled by inner laws, from the movement of the biggest planets in the universe to the smallest particles that exist on Earth. All of these things have some kind of laws that you can study and understand. So why would we think that the same basic principle can't be applied to human beings? So this is really our beginning point. As Marxists, we understand that all of history is an interrelated process. Things do not happen arbitrarily. There's some kind of reason for these developments. So our first question is, what are the laws that drive history? And I'd say the most basic law, the most important law from a Marxist viewpoint is the role of economics. We believe in to put it simply, that economics serves as the basis of society. And by economics, I mean it in the most general sense. That is the production and exchange of all the necessities of life, everything that it takes to keep humanity alive. And there's a simple reason for this. Before we can think or act, before we can engage in science and philosophy or politics, we must have enough food, water, clothing, and shelter to survive. So this is the starting point. And how production is carried out will serve as the basis for the legal, moral, and political structures of each society. And on these structures emerge things like art, philosophy, religion, and science. Now, these different structures, with their own forms of production, with their own class structure, we would define these as modes of production. And history is, we would say it's a progressive process, because the movement of history is based on the improvement of production. As we conquer production, as we conquer nature and improve production, we produce in new ways. And these new forms of production create new divisions of labor and new economic classes each with their own relationship to production. And from this follows new modes of exchange. That is, new ways to distribute the wealth created by society. And this, therefore, creates changes in the entire legal, political, and social structure that already exist. So yeah, really history is this process of improving production and into entering new forms, new modes of production. So as Engels said, the cause of great social changes is not to be found in people's brains, but in changes to the economic base of society, changes in production. And really, the development and the development of class society in and of itself is proof of this process, because class oppression did not always exist. The vast majority of human history has existed in the state of primitive communism. These are essentially tribal hunter-gatherer groups where you have no class oppression, no significant wealth inequality, no private property, and no state, right? And this isn't just because people were, nicer a few 100,000 years ago, but it was based on the economic needs of society. Primitive communism is based on a very low development of the productive forces. There could be no rich or poor because in the best of times, the collective only produced enough to sustain itself. I'd say it's also based on a physical need. Humans have virtually no real physical edge over other large mammals. So we needed this sort of close cooperation and this general equality in order to survive. And I'd say prehistory is marked by a slow and steady development of the productive forces. There's a reason that modern-day anthropologists will break up these early prehistoric cultures based on the types of tools that they used. Humans began this process of refining tools, making new tools, right? And I'd say there came a fundamental turning point with one very important invention, and that is agriculture. With the development of agriculture, for the first time ever, it became possible to produce an economic surplus. That means people were able to produce more than they could immediately consume. And this opened up the possibility to free up a layer of society from the need to perform physical labor. And these people subsisted off of the work of others. And on this basis arose economic inequality, and these people became the first ruling class. And on this basis, you had the state. The state emerged as a tool for these new, this new layer of rich people to enforce their class rule. They create special armed bodies of men, prisons, legal systems, in order to maintain their domination over the rest of collective. And I would say, this basic history puts to bed any argument that there's just kind of some kind of fixed eternal human nature. One look at history will tell you that this simply is not true. Marx once said that history is nothing but a continuous transformation of human nature. And I'd say this transformation is based first and foremost on changes to production. And I'd say history happens in a progressive way. Each mode of production emerges from conditions laid by the previous mode of production, and they contain within themselves the basis for a new mode of production. You see this kind of like interconnection, right? For example, capitalism was not an accidental thing, but it emerged from the economic conditions laid down from feudalism. Under feudalism, you had this urban guild production that served as the basis for capitalist industry. And it also served as kind of like an embryonic form of capitalist wage labor, capitalist class oppression. The guild masters represented a sort of nascent bourgeoisie. And the journeymen in these guilds, the apprentices, were a very early proletariat. Under feudalism, you also had a sizable layer of these rich, independent peasants who began hiring labor to work their land. So here you also have these wage labor relationships taking form. There's also this period of the age of exploration, which is very interesting period where you had all these feudal monarchies that were funding these expeditions to the New World. You know, they were driven by this thirst for gold and all of the new wealth that existed in, you know, the newly discovered Americas. But without realizing it, they were preparing their own overthrow. They were decaying the base for feudalism. And that's because they were encouraging the growth of this money-based market economy that was, essentially decaying feudalism, agrarian production, and they were enriching this new bourgeoisie that began acting independently and was trying to find ways to overthrow the old layer. So I'd say, this is an example of how there's always changes that's happening to production. There are always changes happening to the economic base. But the effects of economics on politics is not immediate or automatic. And what I mean by that is that history isn't defined by a slow transition between different systems. But really, different modes of production are separated by massive convulsions, really revolutionary periods, right? And I'd say anybody who studied, the Marxist philosophy will really see that this is a dialectical understanding of history. Everything contains within itself contradictions that allow it to develop. The ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus said that strife is the necessity of life. Contradiction is a thing that's just inherent to reality. But eventually, you have a situation where all these contradictions start to pile up, and they become insurmountable, and they necessitate an absolute transformation of the thing they're contained within, right? And this is exactly what we see in a period like the transition from feudalism to capitalism, where it's really the economic base of society, the economic content of society is increasingly coming into conflict with the feudal form of society, right? And in these stages, the only way for production to develop further is through an overthrow of the system that existed before. In other words, these really are revolutionary periods, and this opens the door to a new form of class rule and a new mode of production. And this is exactly how capitalism came into being. You had a series of revolutions led by the bourgeoisie. Revolutions like the French Revolution, the English Civil War. You had two revolutions in the Americas, and they played this role of overthrowing the feudal ruling class, and they tore down all of the barriers that were put up in front of capitalist development. And this allowed for capitalism to really explode and to flourish in the period after. So, and I'd say in the events that a revolutionary class fails to take power, what you typically see is the common ruin of all the classes that existed before. I don't have time to get into it, but Rome is really the classic example of this. Now, I think I've laid down the basic method. From here, I want to address a few common attacks against this, and in that way, hopefully, raise our understanding of it. The first is a very popular strongman of historical materialism. It's that economics, it's this idea that, Marxists just say economics is the sole determining factor in historic development, that Marxists reduce everything down to economics. And I'd say this is it's rooted in an overly mechanical view of cause and effect. Now, we do view economics as the main thing that drives history. And ultimately, ideas do play a secondary role. But ideas don't play, it's not that ideas play no role at all. It's the exact opposite. Ideas play a very big role in human history. Why would we be having a school like this if ideas didn't play a role? I'd probably be, I'd relax and I'd be doing something else, I don't know. So, and really the struggle between different ideas, it plays a fundamental role in human history. Great historical struggles usually take place among, political, philosophical, or religious lines. Rarely have they ever taken place on just open, conscious economic lines, right? And I think there's a Marx quote that explains this kind of relationship, where he said that material force must be overthrown by material force. But theory also becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. So I'd say the relationship between ideas and economics is complex, right? It goes back to this whole view of cause and effect. A Marxist believes that cause and effect flow into one another. An effect can be a cause, and a cause can become effect. All ideas, somewhere in history, do have an economic foundation. But as soon as they've emerged, ideas tend to develop a life on their own and develop according to their own laws. And ideas can turn around and have an impact on the economic base. I'd also add an important detail, is that all new ideas start in the ideas that came from the past. So you can have ideas that are technically outdated and have ceased to play really a direct economic role, but still have an influence. And maybe one example of this that I can highlight is really the role of religion. Religion still exists today, despite the fact that the immediate economic conditions for religion, have been weakened or eradicated, right? And a good example of this is actually, I'd say, Israel's genocide in Gaza, right? The ruling class in Israel isn't necessarily motivated fully by economics here. There are no resources in Gaza to dominate. They're not looking to exploit the labor that exists in Gaza. And I'd say the other thing is that the war has been very destructive to Israel's economy. But the fact is, to a great degree, the ruling class has been motivated by religion. Now, the Italian Marxist Labriola would say that ideas don't fall out of the sky, which is, I think, a very helpful way of looking at it. Ideas come from somewhere real, and at a certain point did have some kind of material origin. And I would say really the role is that great economic changes determine the kinds of changes that take place in human thought. There's an Engels quote that's a little bit long. I think it's very helpful, and I'm going to explain it, so just bear with me. He said, "So with all other accidents and apparent accidents in history, the further removed the field we happen to be investigating is from the economic, and the closer it comes to the domain of pure abstract ideology, the more we will find that it reveals accidents in its development, and the more does the course of its curve run in zigzag fashion. But fit a trend to the curve, and you will find that the longer the period taken, the more inclusive the field treated, the more closely will this trend run parallel to the trend of economic development." So really what that means is that we can't trace every single development in ideas back to a single economic cause, but periods where we have big, great conflicts of ideas tend to be motivated by economics. And I'd say maybe a really good example of this is the Protestant Reformation. This was the schism between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church, right? And this was a schism that reflected the two great class forces at the time. Catholicism embodied the feudal aristocracy, and Protestantism corresponded to the class outlook of the rising bourgeoisie. And you can see this in a few ways. First of all, Protestantism was imbued with a sort of democratic character. The Catholic Church represents the Pope and clergy as our links to God. And really, if you want to be saved, then you have to go to these figures to get salvation. And really, in the whole period before this, there was no way for you to read the Bible even if you didn't go to church. The Bible was not available in any common language. It was only available in Latin. And the priests were generally the only people who could read Latin. So you had this kind of direct reliance on the Catholic Church for your own spiritual salvation. But the Protestants believed that everyone has their own personal link to God. So this kind of represented the striving of the bourgeoisie against the feudal system. They wanted to begin overthrowing the influence that the feudal aristocracy had on religion. I'd say another example of this is really that the Catholic Church demanded devotion through service. You're expected to make regular cash payments, and Catholic churches are really defined by these big, elaborate displays of wealth to them, right? But on the other hand, the Protestants didn't believe in cash payments, and Catholic churches were much more somber and austere, right? And this really represented the desire of the bourgeoisie to begin accumulating wealth for investment, right? They didn't want to give it all away to the church. So, moving on to that point about economic reductionism, I wanted to go to another common attack. This is another thing you hear all the time. People will say that the Marxist view of history is fatalist, that things happen automatically, everything is predetermined, and there is no role for the individual. And I'd say if Marx actually believed this, then he would not have been a revolutionary at all. And I think he would have written his works, and I think he would have just kind of given up after that, right? Because everything was already preordained to happen. Why was Marx and all the people directly influenced him, why would they fight a revolutionary struggle if they actually believed that everything was predetermined? And it's not true at all. Marx once went so far as to say that history does nothing. History possesses no riches, it fights no battles. It is living human beings that do all these things. So it's ultimately individuals who do create history. It's individuals with their own aims, ideas, and passions. But these wills don't remain just isolated, right? You have many individual wills that sort of act together and they fuse into these opposing and common forces. So individuals, of course, do have a great effect on history, but they can only have an influence as long as the social relationships that exist allow them to have an influence. For someone to act as, a great man, so to speak, they must reflect the needs of some social force that exists. And I'd say maybe a good example of this is maybe Hitler. He's not a great man in the way that you would define it most of the time. He was a maniac. But I'd say the explanation for how he came into power is doused with great man theory. Think about the way it was taught to you in high school. Why did Hitler come into power? Why was it possible? Well, the way we're taught about it, it's almost like mystical. He was this charismatic man who hit something in the German psyche, right? He was a very good speaker, and he convinced people to impose a fascist dictatorship. Now, to be honest, if it was that easy, I'd argue that we should take power right away. We have a couple pretty good speakers. We could probably inspire some people. A revolution sounds really easy when you think about it like that. I hear some laughs, but when you present it like this, you see how absurd of an idea this is. This is not a serious explanation of history. In fact, Hitler's rule stemmed out of very real needs of German capitalism. At the time, German capitalism was an extremely poor state, and the capitalists needed to strip back every gain that had been won by the German working class over the past century. They needed the maximum level of exploitation to repair their wealth, really. And that required a fascist movement to destroy the workers' organizations and to impose a fascist dictatorship. And it was only even possible to do this because of the preceding couple decades of the German movement. Since 1918, you had a whole series of revolutions and mass movements that failed because of betrayals from the reformists and mistakes by the communists. And this exhausted the working class. They weren't able to fight back at the decisive moment, and it emboldened the forces of reaction to swing behind Hitler, right? And I just point out, too, that remember, Hitler tried to take power in 1923, and he failed. Clearly, it was not his will that was the dominant factor here, right? It was secondary to something else, which were the needs of German capitalism. So I think this brings us into our final and maybe our most important question. What is the role of the individual in history, and how can we have an impact on history? Now, we understand that history is driven by real laws that we cannot completely control. We can accelerate or obstruct the general historical process, but we can't change its general course. But freedom doesn't come from escaping the laws of our world, but in discovering them. Plekhanov explained that freedom is recognizing and pursuing what's historically necessary. And bring back the example of the natural sciences. Science frees us in the sense that studying the laws of nature gives us the ability to manipulate them to our own advantage. A pilot is not free to fly because we've willed away the rules of gravity, but because we've begun to master them, and we know how to manipulate gravity. And I'd say historical materialism, the Marxist view of history, it gives us the same insight. We understand that not only things can change, but things must change. No system has ever lasted forever, and revolutions are inevitable. And I would say that this applies to socialism. Socialism can exist because its conditions are being laid in the conditions created by capitalism. Socialism is not just a good idea. It's not just simply the morally right thing to fight for, but it is a historically necessary stage of human development. And this is really what distinguishes Marx from all of the, we would say, utopian socialists who came before him, where they created these very abstract arguments for why we should fight for socialism. Capitalism investigated the real conditions of capitalism, and he discovered the conditions for socialism that existed within them. And I'd say it's crystal clear today. In fact, this is more true today than it was in Marx's time. Capitalism is now the dominant force across the globe. In its hunt for markets, labor, and resources, it's spread to every corner of the globe, save for a handful of pockets here and there. Already in capitalist production, you see the outlines, the potential for a planned economy. In the era of monopoly capitalism, the stage of capitalism we exist in today, you have this incredible sophistication, incredibly sophisticated coordination between different industries. And you have a very high level of economic planning that exists in all of the biggest multinational companies. And the other thing that capitalism has done is it's simplified class relations to the greatest possible extent. The vast majority of humanity is working class or poor, and they all stand in opposition to this capitalist class. And the capitalists themselves have really ceased to play a significant role on production. All these things that they used to do in previous eras, like the administering of business or even the management of workers, these things are now done by salaried employees instead of the capitalists themselves. So the capitalists aren't playing a role in developing production anymore. They've ceased to be anything more than a tiny and shrinking parasite that exists on production. And I'd say in these basic facts, you do see the basis to international socialism. But all of these things are held back by the forms of capitalism. It's held back by private property, the market economy, and all these arbitrary national divisions that exist over the world. All of these things hold this process back from developing further. And I'd say, at the end of the day, it is the working class today that is the revolutionary class in society. And it's not just because the working class is oppressed. It's because of the relationship the working class has to production. It doesn't need the capitalists. The working class holds in its hands all the tools of production, and it has every interest in overthrowing the capitalist class, right? And this is the thing, by fighting for their immediate interests and by overthrowing their oppressors, the working class will be able to free production from the barriers imposed by capitalism and prepare the next step in economic development. And really, under socialism, the creative potential of mankind will be unleashed, right? Things will not be produced by a tiny layer at the top for to enrich themselves, but it will be produced for the general need of society. And on this basis, we'll be able to produce all things in abundance. And this will really mark a fundamental shift. On this basis, inequality will disappear, and with it, class oppression and the state. And there's a very good quote in Capital where Marx said that when the workers take control of production, it will mark the end of humanity's prehistory. So I guess coming back to the question of our role, what is our role in making this happen? Well, there's a difference between the socialist revolution and all previous revolutions that have taken place. Previous revolutions, like the bourgeois revolution, have happened in an unconscious way. It's really just destroyed the forces that exist before, and they didn't really understand the forces that were taking place, right? But socialism is different. A socialist economy is based on the conscious planning of production. Creating the system requires knowing what it is that you're constructing, right? And I'd say that revolutions, in a way, are inevitable under capitalism, right? The working class is always being oppressed. You have these many, many instances of oppression that build up and eventually result in this explosive anger, right? We've seen that many times over the past few years, right? But I'd say the experience of all previous revolutions also show that without a conscious socialist leadership that's built and trained in advance, the working class can't take or hold power. Socialism is a historical necessity, but it will not happen if we don't act. We need a revolutionary party and we need to do everything to build a revolutionary party that can provide the working class the leadership that it needs to win. And I think this, above all, is how we need to see ourselves. We are the catalyst for a new stage of humanity. Now, I'm going to be ending relatively soon, actually. I just want to end with this one quote from Trotsky's autobiography that I think embodies this approach very well. He said that to understand the causal sequence of events and find somewhere in the sequence one's own place, that is the first duty of a revolutionary. And at the same time, it is the greatest personal satisfaction possible for a man who does not limit his task to the present day. And I'll end there.